Well, thank you, John. It's a great honor to be able to be in conversation with you. Let me give you a few questions before our audience comes up with some. Michael's great introduction mentioned that you were the ambassador to Singapore, 92, 93, and then later ambassador to China. But even before that, you'd lived in the Far East, 2 times in Taiwan. I know the second one had to be a little bit better than the first since you were married by then and the wonderful Mary Kay was with you. So you speak Mandarin. You've been throughout the Far East, served in very important roles. So you have an insight about the whole area. But let us start with China, primarily because of the recent significant political transition in China. And maybe you could give us your views on the challenges, but also the opportunities for the relationship between the U.S. and China and how it plays with this new transition.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be with you and to Henrietta and Michael and all of those who are here making this possible. My old friend Charles, who we did meet back in '96, and so many others. It's just an honor and privilege to be here with you. The Asia Society is expert at bridging cultures and connecting people. But I suspect you never thought you'd wind up in the same area with Lady Gaga across the street and Governor Rick Perry upstairs. This is truly a diverse set of circumstances in which we find ourselves. Having watched the U.S.-China relationship play out, and when I look at Neil and think of his family and the contributions they made in the earliest days of forging this relationship, it's been 40 years of hard work, finding mutual interests, investing, trading, cultural exchanges, trying to figure out how best to view the future, because that's the hardest part of all. And, people talk about the Asia century, the 21st century. I don't think we do centuries anymore. I think we're moving so quickly, technologically and economically, that we do decades pretty much. And if you don't get it right, you run the risk of losing a decade or maybe several decades. So the opportunities are this. I can't think of another time since 1949 where the cycles of politics have been perfectly synchronized between the United States and China. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we had our elections, which I followed closely, this last November, and it was interesting to note that China's leadership changes at the 18th Party Congress, and China has party congresses every 5 years and have since the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, happened exactly the same time. And I thought, what a coincidence. If ever you wanted to kind of blur any international news or chatter about the changing of the guard to the 5th generation in China, you park the event right about the same time as the U.S. election. But here you have the rise of the 5th generation, Xi Jinping. So we've had Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. 59 years old. He's run a couple of provinces, Zhejiang and Fujian, that in size, population-wise, and in terms of economic output are bigger than most countries. So does he have what it takes intellectually and experience-wise to navigate the economic shoals ahead? There's no question about it. Does he have the political savvy to be able to bring the disparate political factions of China together, realizing that the Communist Party is not a monolith, but rather has a couple of factions? I've watched him work the party, 80 million members and 3,500 outposts across the country. I've watched him work the People's Liberation Army, the largest standing army in the world. I've watched him work the princeling population, of which he is one, which is key to success in politics in China. And he's worked them all with great adroitness. And so you check that box. You say, well, he's very politically astute, and he knows how to work the system. He wouldn't be where he is otherwise. And he's now, as a result of the 18th Party Congress last November, where 2,000 delegates descended in Beijing, and they chopped off on the 370 members of the Central Committee, half of whom are alternate members, who then chopped off on the 25 members of the Politburo, and they finally decided on not 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, as they did after the 16th Party Congress in 2002, but they've shortened the size from 9 to 7. And moreover, when you look at those 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is effectively the board of directors of the country, Xi Jinping has a lot of allies, whereas Hu Jintao did not after the 2002 16th Party Congress. My sense is that after next month, after the events of the People's Congress in March, which happens every year, and where the government now will be around. And the party's been taken care of as of November. Now the government side will be filled out in March. Xi Jinping will spend the rest of the year consolidating power, and he'll be ready to go probably last quarter of this year. The question then on the opportunity side, which now becomes a challenge, is are we ready to go? Are we ready to engage? Because the interesting thing here is, again, for the first time, the cycles of the relationship, which are very distinct, and having worked in the trenches and on the front lines, these cycles are very real. And they're disrupted by externalities from time to time. And they make it impossible for you to get stuff done between both countries. Well, now you've got new leaders in Beijing. We have a re-elected president. We have probably 2 to 3 years of blue sky ahead. That should suggest that we have an opening to get this relationship on the right track. Never going to be easy, but we have an opening. And so now it gets back to the United States and whether we have a strategy, we have a vision that we can then put forward to the Chinese by the end of the year. Both an opportunity and a challenge, although I must say, I don't know that I've ever seen a time when we have been less prepared to deal with China. And I say that in sorrow and as a bit of a lament, because you would think at a time of globalization, as we have matured and as technology has allowed us to make the world shrink considerably, that you'd have a Congress that would be ready to move on China in ways that really do suit our 21st century interests as a country. We don't. I try to find people in our government who know something about the subject matter, who are counterparts to the people in the Foreign Ministry and the Commerce Ministry and the NDRC in China, who, when I first took my trip to China with President Reagan as part of his delegation in the early 80s, still the Mao suits, no English, no exposure to the world, no sense of what the United States is. And you drop into the Foreign Ministry these days, ties, English, degrees from the best universities in the world, and a very deep and nuanced sense of where this country is going. And I say, in order to compete at the negotiating table, as a government, we're going to have to bring forward a generation of people who really do understand the relationship, have invested in the language, the culture, on the ground experience, the economics and the politics. But right now I look around in the executive branch and in Congress, and I draw a whole lot of blanks, and that worries me just a bit.
So you mentioned externalities, and Houston being the energy center of the world, we're very interested in energy over there. In the waters around China, China's been a little fuzzy, but they're asserting jurisdiction or having private citizens having fishing boats, et cetera, assert jurisdiction in part over areas that probably have energy resources. So there's an externality along with the situation in Taiwan, which remains one of the most dangerous situations in the world. So what else do you see in that regard, and how do you see China prepared to deal with those issues to avoid them going the wrong way? Are there factions in China that want one outcome, factions that want a different outcome, and can the leadership keep those in balance and maintain that all-important thing in China's stability?
Northeast Asia is going to remain a hot spot. It has been for a long time. And when you stop to think that the region of Northeast Asia, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, Taiwan, the northern half of China, up to Dongbei, Manchuria, is probably going to be 20% of the world's GDP in the next decade or two. Vibrant, critically important, but if you stop to think that the sea lanes around the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and then beyond, really will be home to 2/3 of our trade as a country. So it's a critically important and strategic lifeline economically for us, so the stakes are extremely high. But you then have to look at the age-old animosities that are playing out in Northeast Asia. and look at the new players who are now on the stage. It's very interesting because generation after generation, the same antagonisms seem to play out. You have Xi Jinping, the son of a former deputy prime minister who made his name fighting with the Japanese in the 30s in China, later rose to prominence as a revolutionary long marcher. And Japan is now run by Shinzo Abe, who comes around now a second time. Now, Japan has had, 17 prime ministers over the last couple of decades. And we hope that there's some stability built into this. But Shinzo Abe's grandfather was one of the leaders in Manchukuo, which was the Japanese-occupied Manchuria. And then you go down to Korea, and Park Chung-hee's daughter is now president. He ran the country from 62 until his assassination in 79, autocratically to be sure, but really got the economy going. In North Korea, you've got Kim Jong-un, young 20-something, son of Kim Il-sung, who fought the Japanese imperialism on the peninsula. In his era, that's how he rose to prominence. And you look at the age-old animosities that still exist in this region. And the one thing that is sacrosanct to every one of them, by dint of their founding documents, whatever they may be, but also by dint of history, whether 1895 or whether the end of World War II, sovereignty. So whether you're talking about the Spratly Islands in the Southeast Asia, the Paracels, the Diaoyu Islands, or the Senkakus as they're called in Japan, whether the atolls that exist in the South China Sea, the Scarborough Reef close to the Philippines, they all deal with one thing, and that's sovereignty. And when you've got 2 or 3 claims without one of them able to give it up because it would be politically untenable to give it up, there is no answer. There is no immediate way to resolve it. So what do? You have no choice other than to manage the hostilities and the tension. You've got to build a framework in Northeast Asia that basically speaks to problem solving, dialogue, confidence, how those waters are used for military purposes, for natural resource purposes, and for fishing purposes, which is a very important part of what goes on there. And the United States has a role to play in being a backstop and in terms of being a judicious advocate for rule of law, openness to free trade and commerce on the seas, and working against the outbreak of any kind of conflict, which is going to be tough, but that is a role the United States can play. Not everybody likes America playing that role, but the Seventh Fleet has been around for a long time, and America's interests in Asia have been pretty solid, at least since 1897, 1898, going back to the Philippines. So when you talk about, the pivot or the rebalancing to Asia, I'm not quite sure what that means, because I've lived in Asia a long time, on and off. We've been there for a long time. Now we're dedicating more Marines to Australia, maybe an additional carrier battle group to the Pacific Command AOR. But our stakes are high. And those hot spots, they don't have an easy answer. They don't have an immediate answer. So it's going to take judicious management of those tensions with all of the protagonists involved.
How about the economy in China? They've been growing in double digit for so many years, and now they're in high single digits, but that makes them worry. They're trying to change the economy, going from export-driven to Chinese consumer-driven. What insights do you have as to their success in doing that, and what's your projection in that regard?
Well, if you look at the 5-year plan launched a year or so ago in Beijing, the journey toward a consumption-based model is inexorable. They're moving there and they're not looking back. So you break down the investment-led export machine, which has goosed the economy for 30 years, allowed them to rack up $3 trillion in foreign exchange earnings, which sounds pretty awesome. And then you start to do the actuarial assumptions over the next 20 years on retirements, and you say, whoa, they're going to have a real financial pinch on their hands. And they know that. The numbers don't work. The math doesn't work in terms of the demographics as you go forward. So if you have a kind of an inverted pyramid or a reverse triangle where you've got 4 grandparents, you've got 2 parents, you've got 1 wage earner. And you've got now an aging demographic with more people leaving the workforce than entering the workforce, and you wonder why labor rates are on the rise in the southern manufacturing zones of Guangdong. This is a trend that is very real in China. They're going to have to manage their numbers. They're going to have to figure out a new economic model that will allow them to expand the base and to develop more industry called innovation, where the internet is going to play inevitably a very important role, and that hasn't been defined, where rule of law and greater respect for human rights will have to be part of the lay of the land. And this has all got to be in the head of Xi Jinping as he approaches this year, trying to figure out how to spend his next 4 years or 5 years before the next party Congress. Then presumably he'll be reinstalled and serve a total of 10 years. But my sense is he has reform DNA in him, as his father did. And he'll move forward, and because the tsunami of demand driven by the people of China, 600 of whom have access to the internet, 90 million bloggers are pushing conversations in China, the likes of which would have landed anybody in a pretty bad place a few short years ago, but it's carrying on. And it's moving the dialogue forward, and the new members of the party hierarchy understand this, and they'll have to make accommodations and changes as they go forward. There's no question about that. But we're going to have to synchronize our Asia-Pacific interests, which are enormous, economically, politically, from a security standpoint, culturally, with those of China. And we today don't have an adequate venue for this kind of dialogue. We have the strategic and economic dialogue where you have, a couple hundred Americans, in Beijing one year, and same from China in the United States the other. Scripted, everyone sticks to their points. You go, around the table, everybody gets, their 5 minutes in. But then you look at the results at the end and you say, we haven't furthered the ball. We've got to fundamentally start doing something different. And that different thing, to my mind, is a head of state to head of state led relationship, because you can't manage the U.S.-China relationship without it being driven by a head of state to head of state kind of construct. Small, strategic. You got to be able to have conversations that develop trust, which sometimes is in short supply. You got to talk about North Korea, which China doesn't want to talk about much of the time. You've got to talk about Syria and weaponization programs in Iran. These are tough and sensitive subjects. You can't do it with 300 people in the room. It's got to be done in a way that promotes real dialogue based not on the quarterly returns of American politics, which is, so here's the deal. You at the negotiating table, if you can imagine this, many of you have sat at the negotiating table in business or government with China. You've got on the Chinese side some of the best long-term strategic thinkers in the world. And on the American side, you have some of the best short-term tactical thinkers in the world. And there's a gap like this. And the challenge is, how do you bridge that gap? How do you reach on each side a little bit farther to get us to the end point? And that's what we haven't yet figured out how to do.
Let's talk about one of those issues which probably impacted and impacts today many companies here, and that's cybersecurity. As we all find that as our experts trace things back, the attacks seem to emanate with great frequency from China. Has the U.S. government, or during your tenure or thereafter, been able to engage and make any headway on that you can give us hope around?
This will be one of the issues of the 21st century. I have no doubt about that, because it has become pervasive. It has entered let's say, the private sector realm of American life, whether the New York Times, whether individual members of Congress. And so when you begin hitting these points of great sensitivity, it becomes a high-profile issue. And then you begin to understand the depth of it all. And it's one that doesn't have an easy answer, because a lot of countries are pretty good at it in the end. And you've got to come up with a framework that speaks to red lines and boundaries. You know what I mean? And you have to have a conversation that's a really hard one to have. And we can explain the reasons for that maybe another time. But you've got to come up with red lines beyond which you don't go. Everyone knows that there will be an intelligence aspect of cyber, and then there will be a a commercial aspect of cyber. And it's a commercial aspect of cyber that is very worrying because of the number of companies and individuals, even in very non-high-tech businesses, who have been hit. And all you have to do is talk to Microsoft, as one of the leading voices on this, and see how many issues of their software are actually paid for in the China market versus those in use. 35 or 40 million issues in circulation, and just a few of them really paid for. So they bring more money out of Norway than they do out of China. Norway is a much smaller economy with much less in the way of prospects in terms of overall volume for Microsoft. But the list goes on and on. This will be a challenge. And we're going to have to, A, come up with countermeasures, which to me is a great economic development opportunity for some of our best brains and our best thinkers and our best companies in this country. See it as an opportunity, not just a threat. And then we're going to have to come up with a public policy piece that speaks to how do you enshrine some operating guidelines that really do allow us to then move forward with some understanding.
You mentioned stability earlier, and just mentioned recently the bloggers. And we seem to learn a lot more about China from the bloggers, about the upset of the local populace with corruption in the society. But it's hard to get a sense of scale on that. With over 1.3 billion people, we have corruption here as well. There's corruption everywhere, but how much corruption exists there? How unhappy is the populace? And what does that mean for the society going forward?
I think this is a big issue. So I was in Shanghai just a few days ago and met with the mayor there, as I did the mayor in Nanjing. And it was interesting. Both of them brought up issues of corruption, how it's on everybody's mind, and they all want to get something done about it. In fact, the mayor in Shanghai basically apologized, saying, sorry, I can't, have a lunch for you or dinner or something. He said, we're just not doing that anymore, not like the old days. And I thought, they're really thinking through this one. Gone are the days of the big banquets and the Mao Tai and the fanciness of it all. And it was interesting because I also gave a speech at a groundbreaking ceremony, and we had a mayor of another big city there, and the speeches were all very short. Why? Well, Xi Jinping, after the 18th Party Congress, set down the rules. And what did he do right after the 18th Party Congress? He went out to one of the military districts, and he gave a speech to some of the military leaders. No more corruption. What did he do after that? He made another stop the next day, gave a similar speech on corruption. And so people are talking about it. To what extent it will kind of permeate the thinking and the actions of folks at all levels, it's a big place, and it's a big party. It's hard to know, but it's on everyone's mind, and I suspect that they're going to continue to make high-profile cases out of those who are breaking the rules. You'll see their faces splashed on the front pages of the local newspapers, and this will be a big deal. But they're taking it very, very seriously, so far as I can tell.
We have several questions, looking through the ones we've just received from the audience, that pertain to environmental issues and China's role in that, and some of them bring in the reports recently about how bad pollution is in Beijing and elsewhere. We were talking, Ryan Lance, at lunch about exactly that issue. Do you have much of a sense of how the leadership is approaching that issue? And of course, this is near and dear to the heart of those of us in the energy business. We'd love to help them find more natural gas and back out some of those coal-fired plants.
Well, let's not do that too quickly, because we have a distinct advantage in this marketplace in terms of our cost of raw materials that what should allow this country of ours to get back on its feet from a manufacturing standpoint. I mean, we've got a huge advantage. I don't think people understand that, a manufacturing company today can be paying what is the equivalent of $15 per barrel of oil, 15 to 20 bucks, whereas China's paying $100 a barrel. The UK is paying 80 to 90 bucks a barrel. If this doesn't mean we can get back in the game to some extent, it's a huge deal. So, China will move toward their own natural resources, but they've got pipeline issues, infrastructure issues, refining issues. Air quality is a big one. When I was in Shanghai last week, so having lived in Beijing before, I've lived in, I remember Taipei. I've lived in Taipei twice, going back to the late 70s where it was pretty polluted. And then again in the 80s, some improvements have been made. I went back to Taipei 2 weeks ago. Air is clean, clear as a bell. And one of the biggest improvements that have been made in the overall atmospherics of Taiwan, I think, really is air quality, expansion of civil society air quality. And it was absolutely amazing at the airport there to see. I was surrounded by folks from the mainland who were coming over to visit. And if somebody had told me when I was living in Taiwan in the late 70s that you would live to see the day when Taiwan and China would have a free trade agreement, ECFA, where there would be 300 to 400 flights a week back and forth, I would have called you crazy. And that's where we are today. In fact, it's the most amazing thing because you can go have a serious meeting with your Chinese counterpart, and in the first 30 to 45 minutes of the meeting, Taiwan isn't even mentioned. You know, we have so many other things on the global stage that now have, you know, taken a priority. I didn't think I'd live to see that day either. But that's just an aside. If Beijing is to become a world-class city, which it is in a whole lot of ways, but it isn't in terms of livability because of air quality, it's going to have to focus on its environmental stewardship. Shanghai, when it got to the extent that I saw last week, usually the breeze from the Hangzhou Bay pretty much clears it out. It's got a natural current that is right in the area. But it was pretty impenetrable just this last week. It's an issue. And I know they're making a lot of decisions on renewable energy, on clean energy, on expanding ring roads, on serving also on the board of Ford Motor Company. You know, there's a race to get to electric cars. I think this is a very big deal. And China's doing a whole lot on electric cars, and I think, you know, it's for a reason. They're going to be going from, 17 million cars a year to 40 million cars a year to 70 million cars a year in the next couple of decades, and you can only imagine what it's going to look like at that point. So having technology that will sustain their growth is going to be critically important. But I think the goal, and I used to argue this as governor, let's not talk about our environmental stewardship just to be, green people. Let's talk about it in terms of our stewardship to the next generation, but also about jobs for this generation. Because if you're first to conquer a certain technology, and if you own that technology in terms of how you power your economy and how you clean up your act, that's a huge advantage in the marketplace, a huge advantage. And I think we just need to be mindful that China's moving quickly in this direction. We shouldn't lose sight of what we can do in this country as well in terms of producing the technologies of tomorrow. Natural gas is going to be a significant bridge. And that's exactly what we need. We need a bridge to the inevitable future where you've got sun and wind that are powering most of your, we're just not there yet. We'll get there at some point, inevitably. Science will take us there.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that, and we do have several questions, again, from maybe the Houston perspective, about your view on the fact that in the Far East in particular, they spend 5-6 times what people in the U.S. spend for natural gas. And so what's your view on exports of natural gas in LNG form that could be able to offset that and make more of a global market for LNG?
Well, I think a global marketplace is inevitable. And anytime you choke up a marketplace, it disfigures your economic performance ultimately. And I say that against my own interests. I mean, we've got a family chemical business, and I'm sure that you would argue, keep restrictions on so you can keep prices more competitive here at home. But I'd have to say there's going to be a global market eventually. And we should lead in terms of developing our resources at a pace that others cannot catch. And with it, we ought to be developing our fracking technologies along with others that really do allow us to exploit it in an environmentally friendly way, in ways that recognize the needs of tomorrow.
Do you have any sense of how the discussion that was ongoing during the election, there was very strong statements made by whoever that fellow was who won the Republican nomination instead of you, and about putting sanctions on the Chinese because of currency manipulation, as he characterized it. Give us your view on the currency valuation in China and what's the real issue there and what should the United States policy be about that?
The campaign was an interesting journey.
There's an understatement, huh?
You know, and Mary Kay is here, who was wonderfully patient through it all. But she, you know, she set down a marker as we were beginning our journey, and she said, "I just want to be abundantly clear on one point." She said, "If you pander or if you sign any of those damn pledges, I'm going to leave you." And I thought, what?
Good for you.
I thought, what am I going to do now? There's no way that you can, you know, even begin to be competitive in some of the early primary states. But I got so bored during one of those debates. You know, it became like game shows after a while. You know, everyone kind of memorizes their lines and they spit them out, and you know, a little red meat here, a little red. I couldn't do that. I'm not into that. I gave one of my answers in Chinese because I was so bored on the stage. And
I remember.
I remember. It didn't go over so well with that crowd, as I recall. But, you know, this is a time, as we've discussed earlier, where we need an absolutely clear-headed strategic conversation on the U.S.-China relationship. And we got zero from either side. And that really kind of concerns me. We should have had articulated on both sides a strategy for this country. And now we kind of amble forward with no strategy at all. And you just kind of hope that it all works out well. And that's kind of where we are, and that's a little maddening after we've been through 1 year of debate. But on China, you know, after they got over to me on the corner, you know, they pretty much declared war on China at least 3 times. And then I'd have to sit there and say, well, let me just explain what we need to do with China, because I've done it before. And it may not sound sexy, or it may not contain a lot of red meat, but our stakes are pretty high, and we've got to get it right. There was not a whole lot of interest in discussing a long-term strategic relationship with China, how you get the dynamic right, and how you move toward a relationship that is suited for the next generation. There was a whole lot more interest in talking about, let me put it this way, it's much easier in a primary debate to be able to say what you're going to do to China instead of what you're going to do with China. And our whole conversation needs to be about what we're going to do with China. Okay, we all disagree on things. We're all going to have, with a $500 billion trading relationship, the largest this world has ever known, you're going to have trade disputes. That's just an inevitable part of growth. You know, some of the most difficult trade disputes have been with, you know, Airbus subsidies and the European Union, softwood lumber with Canada. These are our close trading partners. You know, we're going to have trade complaints. But there wasn't a lot of discussion about how we get it right over the long term. So getting around to, you know, having a conversation about our long-term interests for a relationship that is the most important of the 21st century, and one that our kids are going to rely upon as to whether or not our generation got it right or not, is terribly important. And we just don't have the ability to have those conversations right now. Maybe the political dynamic will change, and here's how I think it will change a bit. Because the U.S.-China relationship is going to become more localized. And as it becomes more local, it will become more human. Because people at the local level will begin to understand the stakes of the relationship. I'm talking about local exporters, teachers, educators who are beginning to get, you know, cultural exchanges and educational exchanges, local agricultural exporters. I remember when the alfalfa farmers in Utah got access to the China market, all of a sudden China became a partner. You know, the currency of peace was playing out. As opposed to something to fear, it was someone with whom to engage. And so we somehow need to pivot to the opportunity factor as opposed to just the fear factor. And that will come as our economic relationship grows. We get more exports into China, which is only inevitable because their currency will be more and more pegged to market realities. They'll pivot more to a consumption model where they'll be buying a lot more of our goods. And with that will be exports from every community, big and small, in this country. And as that happens, you'll have mayors engaged, you'll have governors engaged, you'll have people who want to get the relationship right. And they will begin to force a conversation in town hall meetings with our elected representatives that are more along the lines of what do we do with China as opposed to what do we do to China. But I think we're some years away from that.
I'm afraid I've just got time, I think, for one more question, but I'm going to give you all the ones we didn't get to ask. We have a lot of great ones from students in particular. And there's so many questions about, and it has the number 2016 in it again and again. But I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator and ask you my question about 2016, because you mentioned Lady Gaga. So is it true that you're forming a group called Wizard 2? And that in 2016 you plan to rule the Far East as the premier progressive rock singer in Mandarin?
Well, it is
You have
true
to know that he did
It
this
is true
in
that
Iceland.
all the washed-up bands from the 60s and 70s can always get gigs touring the Asia-Pacific region. I've seen that. But more importantly, what does a failed rock and roll musician do? That was my question in my younger years. Well, you go into politics, of course. That's a natural fallback for a rock. So here we are, ambling forward, not quite sure of the future.
Well, thank you very much. It's a
It's
great
a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.